Hi everyone, it's Tammy Sherrill, and welcome to the first class, first week uh, in Health 2250. And this narrated PowerPoint is going to be around knowing and evidence-informed practice. So our objectives for this piece are to begin to be able to describe ways of knowing, to describe what evidence-informed practice is. We'll discuss the role of evidence-informed practice in healthcare, linking that a little bit more specifically with nursing, describe the role of research in evidence, and then in a subsequent lecture, narrated PowerPoint, we'll dive into the two major paradigms in research, quantitative and qualitative. So let's just begin to think about knowledge and what it is. And so the production of knowledge, or our ways of knowing, begin in a variety of different ways. So, we like to ask ourselves the question, how does the production of knowledge begin? And often it might begin with a clinical question or a query. You might be thinking, is there a better way to do this, a more efficient way to do this, a better approach that would service patients and clients easier, safer? Sometimes it comes out of arguments, two people debating on which is the best approach. Sometimes it just comes out of curiosity. Just thinking, is this the best approach? And I'm going to share a story later on that really speaks to curiosity. And then lastly, problems. You encounter patient challenges, client problems, and you need to come up with a way to solve that. And so this is often the way that knowledge is produced. So, that notion of how do we find reliable answers to our questions? There's a lot of different sources, and we'll talk a little bit about that and dive into a little bit on how do we get the knowledge that we seek and the answers to our questions. So I always like to start off with this fun exercise in class. We're not in class together, but I still would love you to think about it. And when we begin to think sort of more philosophically about our ways of knowing, how do we know what we know? I'd like to challenge you to think about what criteria do you use to pick your shampoo? And there can be a lot of different influences that impact this criteria. It might be cost. It might be the way it smells. It might be how it's delivered out of the bottle. Is it easy, to get out of the container when you're in the shower? You have super curly hair, and this shampoo helps to tame your curls. This shampoo makes your hair feel fuller or more nourished. This shampoo has been passed down through your family. Everybody's always used this shampoo. It could come from a recommendation from a professional, maybe your hairstylist or, in a salon. So just thinking about that and then thinking about how we could apply that to ways of knowing in relation to how we acquire knowledge. So one of the ways we acquire knowledge is through personal experience. So what we might call the lived experience. And it is you see it, you experience it, you feel it. There's often could be emotion involved with that, and you accept it to be true. Another way is tradition. So it is the way that things have always been. It's inherited, it's historical, and certainly in nursing, we have some things, and in healthcare, that we do because we've always done it that way. And so it's that curious individual that says, is this the best approach, or is there another way to do this? Another way is just through common sense. It's our everyday reasoning. It's what makes sense. It's the safest approach. It's the sensible approach. It's the most efficient approach. Media certainly plays a huge role on how we acquire knowledge, more so today than ever. When we look at TV, radio, but our whole experience with the internet and social media, newspapers, all those important sources of information truly, increase our knowledge on certain things. And then authority, lastly, is that sense of experts. So for younger students or children, they might be parents, they could be teachers, professors, experts in the field. A lot of books are written by experts who have an authority in a certain area. And so often in nursing as well, we would look to those people to provide knowledge on specific topics and issues. And so let's talk a little bit more about nursing. There is a sort of an approach to acquiring knowledge in nursing, and there's been 4 different specific sort of areas, I guess, discovered in nursing. So the first one is personal knowing. So when you began to study nursing, you think about what knowledge did you possess? Did you have any previous experience with healthcare, with nursing, etc.? And then consider what you have learned since you've come into nursing. Now most of you are probably in second year, and think about things you've learned in your personal life, how to transition from high school to university, how to succeed in university, study skills, and then through all your practice experience so far to date, and courses that you've taken. So personal knowing. Empirical knowing is one of the ways we employ this knowledge is through the use of evidence-based practice, which is going to be a big focus in this course. So it's often referred to as the science of nursing. We talk about nursing being a science and an art. So this is, evidence-based, research-based practice that drives our approach. And so, can you relate to how study findings have changed your nursing practice? Have you had an experience where you read or heard about some particular research findings that might have changed the way you practiced? Ethical knowing is the third way, and ethical knowing helps one develop kind of our moral code, our sense of knowing what is right and wrong. And specifically in nursing, we have a code of ethics, and that guides us and helps us develop our moral code. So, a question I would propose to you is, can you think of an occasion in your nursing practice to date where you needed to make an ethical decision? And if you haven't had a lot of clinical experience yet and haven't encountered that, you certainly will in the future. Maybe you've had to make an ethical decision in some other aspect of your life. And the last one, aesthetic knowing. Aesthetic knowing is kind of like that aha moment that we have when we uncover something new. And just as an artist creates a painting, you are afforded the opportunity of a new perspective. So consider a time when you had an aha moment try and think about that in relation to nursing and how you came to make that discovery. All right, let's move on to look at the nature of knowledge. So knowledge, a good preliminary definition of knowledge in which human beings have really deliberately and rigorously attempted to overcome the weaknesses of some of those traditional ways of knowing that we talked about. And the best way to go about this is looking at knowledge as justified true belief. And that is founded on sort of four main principles, I guess I'd say, and these are actually articulated in your textbook. So how do we know what we know? So certainty, well, let's start with evidence. So evidence, this knowledge is based on actual traceable thing. So there's a paper trail, there's research evidence or data gathered that supports this piece of knowledge specifically. Certainty is, it is hard, if not possible, to deny. It's just certain that this is the right way to go about doing things, that this is a sound piece of knowledge. Practicality is, it has to work in the real world. So sometimes research is done and we might find something really interesting, but what about the feasibility and practicality of applying it in the real world or in a practice setting? You know, you might discover a drug that, lowers blood pressure by 1 to 2 millimeters of mercury. Is that something we'd really consider? Is it make a big enough difference? Or it could be something you discover that is just impossible or not feasible in your particular clinical setting. It might work in Norway or India or, Pakistan, but it might not work in your particular setting. And the last one is broad agreement. So many others agree it is true. So there's kind of universal or broad agreement amongst a number of different individuals and professionals that this makes sense and this is true. Two forms of knowledge I'd like to highlight, and once again, these are discussed in your textbook quite clearly, is explicit and tacit knowledge. So explicit knowledge is very formal and systematic. It's typically expressed in words and numbers, easily communicated and shared. You can think about some of the things in your nursing textbooks would be likely examples of explicit knowledge. It's usually considered of more value in healthcare, and historically has, although we're starting to put more weight or value on tacit knowledge. And explicit knowledge is more closely aligned with quantitative research. Tacit knowledge, on the other hand, is highly personal. It's hard to formalize and it's difficult to share. And the example in the textbook is riding a bike. How do you go about describing to someone how to ride a bike? So sometimes it's difficult to share. It's very subjective. You have personal insight and perspectives about it. It might be related to intuitions or hunches or know-how. And so it's more closely aligned with qualitative research. How do we know what we know? I'd like to just begin to think about this in relation to what do you currently use as knowledge sources for your nursing practice? And what might other nurses or healthcare professionals use? So just thinking about that, you can think about situations maybe in class or from a lab situation, or maybe you've been on clinical and you've had to look something up. Where did you turn to? You ran across a problem and you didn't know how to solve it. Where did you get the information or knowledge that you needed to do that? You had to perform a procedure. You'd never done it before. Who do you turn to? Those types of things. When we look at knowledge sources, this is a bit of a dated study, but there's been very little research done in the last decade on this because I think we really came to know, what the knowledge sources nurses reach for are. And this study was actually done in 2 university hospitals in Turkey. And the research study reported it was a questionnaire-based investigation, so it was just really descriptive research. A questionnaire collected data at one point in time, and they investigated the knowledge sources used by nurses in these 2 hospitals. Interesting is that 78.5% of the nurses said that practice should be based on evidence. 75.9% stated that this evidence should come from research, and 80.7% stated that evidence-based practice was useful. What was really interesting is nurses identified that they first used information their colleagues shared. So you might encounter a problem and you go to your, another nurse and you say, have you ever seen this before? What would you do in this situation? What's the best approach? That kind of thing. They use the practices that have worked for them for years, and sometimes, those historical practices, and that's often where we can run up against barriers or roadblocks to instituting new or innovative approaches in practice. So that kind of relates to the ways they have always done it. Nurses do value in-service training on their individual units or care centers or community-based, wherever they're working. And they also base it on information learned in nursing school. But, that can quickly change, right? If you've been out of practice 5 years, things certainly may have changed. And so when I just like you to think about, could you identify what might be the issues with some of these ways of knowing? So acquiring research-based knowledge in nursing, and I include midwifery because sometimes we have midwifery students in this course as well. So I've alluded to a little bit to some of the barriers or facilitators to nurses utilizing research in practice and research as a way of knowing. So some of the challenges might be that they might not be aware of research findings. So if we're not up to date on current research in our area of practice, we just might not be aware. They may not associate or communicate with those who do research. They might have difficulty finding or locating good research. And that's one of the purposes of this course is you learning to be able to appraise and identify, a strong research article. Research language is complex and it's not often clinically meaningful. The individual may not understand the research methods. Luckily now to graduate with a degree in nursing, everyone has a research, basic research course. So hopefully that's helped a lot. Some individuals might put lower value on research. Nurses don't have time to access it. They have limited computer or database accessibility, or they may not understand what evidence-based practice is. And sometimes it does come down to fear of the unknown or fear of change. So I encourage you to think about how you could apply this in your own context. Don't feel you have authority to make change sometimes. Let's touch on evidence-informed decision making, which is a huge focus. So sometimes it's also called evidence-informed practice, evidence-informed nursing, medicine, midwifery, evidence-based practice. But the key concept in all of these terms is the use of evidence to support practice. So what is evidence-based practice? So I have 3 particular definitions here, and I'd like you to read each one of them and kind of look for what I would describe as themes or patterns in each of these definitions. And so some of the things that I would highlight is this notion of integration of best evidence, but that's not it alone. We combine it with clinical expertise and patient values. So we might find a wonderful piece of new research, but if the patient isn't interested in that, or we don't have the clinical expertise to be able to apply that, it might be impossible. It does talk about the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence. And we use that to make decisions about the care of individual patients or clients. And then lastly, once again, it's drawing on that notion of patient values, patient-focused care. We are focused on individualizing care and yet recognizing that contribution of clinical expertise to care delivery. So I introduced this model to you. It's, pardon me, the transdisciplinary model of evidence-based practice. It was first designed in 2009, and it's not specific to nursing, but indeed more generic to healthcare. And I think it was actually designed for physicians initially. But the things that we need to think about in relation to evidence-informed practice is, if we look at the blue circle, that's evidence, that's the best available research evidence, the most recent, the most valid, the most generalizable. But that alone is not something that we would make a move on. We need to consider, in the big pink circle, the environmental and organizational context. That's the, could we do it here? Should we do it here? Is it feasible? We look at the importance of decision making and weighing pros and cons. We look at our client population, their specific characteristics, needs, values, their preferences, and then our resources, including practitioner expertise. So all of those combine together to ideally contribute to evidence, the highest form of evidence-informed practice. So what is research? I'm going to bring up 3 definitions similar to I did with evidence. And I just encourage you to read these and kind of look for those themes or patterns in each of these definitions. Some of the things that jump out for me is research is in-depth. It's very systematic. There's a very systematic approach to how we do research. It's rigorous. We answer questions and we solve problems through research. And research is a way to generate new knowledge or also to develop or refine existing knowledge. So we might be building on a body of research that's already been completed, or we might be forging beyond those boundaries and actually investigating and creating brand new knowledge. So research as evidence. A key part of evidence-informed practice is having that sound body of research. And so I'm introducing you to the evidence-informed practice wheel here. You can see it here, and our focus in this course, as previously mentioned, is going to dive into the first 4 steps in this research informed practice process. So the first step is in defining your research question and being really, really clear about what it is you're interested in knowing more about, in developing a question that is answerable. And that is one of the greatest challenges is right from the get-go, is being able to define your question. And then, so you run into a problem on your clinical unit, you come up with a question or a curiosity or a query, and then you want to be able to search for best evidence or research. And so we're going to dive into a little bit of that with Carrie Merkley, our nursing librarian, and look at, we have a question. How can we search for the best and highest level of evidence available? Then we'll develop skills around appraisal. So you might find a research piece, but how do we know it's good? How do we appraise that? What are we looking for as far as strengths and weaknesses? And then lastly, so we have a research question. We find 10 specific articles on that question. We appraise all those articles as high quality research, and then we try and synthesize the findings and put it together to answer our research question and decide on best practice. What are we going to do? And so I just encourage you to think about how you can participate in evidence-based practice. I'd like you to think of a clinical situation that you've been in which generated questions in your mind for maybe which you had no answers. There are several ways in which you may try to find an answer to your question. And we've discussed several of those options previously. So I'm going to share a little story about heparin versus saline flushes. So years and years ago, in a patient with a IV, and we wanted to be able to lock that off and separate the patient from the IV pump and the bag and everything, and allow them to be mobile, or maybe they were going to go home with an IV locked intravenous and come in daily for antibiotics or something like that. Anyway, historically we've always used heparin. And one particular nurse raised the curiosity or the question, do we have to use heparin? Is there another solution that would keep that IV patent based on the fact that, we're accessing it at least every 24 hours or every 8 hours or whatever? And so a study was done comparing heparin flushes to saline flushes and looking at did the IV remain patent, for how long, what was the patient's comfort with heparin versus saline flushes, cost, heparin versus saline, etc. And so what it was determined and what is practiced today is that we use saline. Saline's less expensive. It's less painful when you initially inject it or infuse it. Heparin often causes pain and irritation at the site. It keeps the IV open as long as previously. So that was just an example of a curiosity that has changed practice for good, permanently. Okay, well, thank you for listening. And I think that the next, we're going to dive into looking at the two major paradigms, quantitative and qualitative. Thank you for listening.